Intellectual Revolution That Defines Society by Group 4. The reporter will be Ms. Salve V. Cataroja, Mr. Joed Melchor, and Ms. Gwyneth Policarpio. Here is the list of the topic that will be discussed by the reporters. The main objective of this video is first to give a greater knowledge of the great scholar in history responsible for the technological revolution. 2. An in-depth analysis of how the scholar have influenced and shaped the science and technology landscape. And 3. More information on the status information and technology in other states. So listen everyone, as the discussion will be started by the reporters.
Hi guys, I'm Salve V. Cataroja from Group 4, and I will be the first reporter to discuss our topic, which is all about intellectual revolution that define our society. So let's start in Copernican ideas. So what is Copernican ideas? It is from Nicholas Copernicus, which is his first theory of the universe, and he also simply said that our planet is the center of the universe, or simply the Earth is the center of the universe where the planets, moons, and stars revolve in it. And this is called geocentric model. So geocentric model is first deeply embedded in our everyday life. It is common sense because people did not feel any movement back then. So when they stood up in the ground, they don't feel that the earth is moving. So it seems like there's no observational evidence and that the planet was moving either. So this geocentric model is simply an explanation where the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars are all revolving around the earth at the very different speeds. So this system are widely relied during ancient world and embedded in classical philosophy through the brilliant work of these two great astronomers, which is Plato and Aristotle, in 4th century BC. So Greeks sum up this movement of the planets, and seems like there is still lacks of evidence and data. So geocentric system got a problem and inadequacies, and they also discovered that the orbits in the known planets has a complex paths. So where the Ptolemaic system arise. So this Ptolemaic system is also like a geocentric system, but the person who did this is Ptolemy. He thought that the universe was a set of spheres surrounding Earth. Ptolemaic system was like a geocentric model where he said that the Earth is the center of the universe and all the other planets like stars and the suns revolve or circled around it. So these theories about universe like Ptolemy's that view the Earth as the center is called geocentric. Basta pag ang center is Earth, it is geocentric. So here's Ptolemy, is a Greco-Roman astronomer and geographer from Alexandria, and this Ptolemaic system arose in 2nd century AD. So to go around this complication, Greek astronomer introduced the new idea of epicycle or suborbits, around which planets circle as the central pivot points that were carried around the sun. So to put it simply explain, so the Earth is at the center, then there's an orbit around the Earth and another suborbit na nakakonect sa orbit. Then nandun yung other planets and dun sila nagro-rotate or nagsa-circle in the central pivot. So that's the explanation. And Aristarchus, another person that used eccentric trigonometric measurements to calculate the relative distance of the sun and the moon in 3rd century BC. So he was the first astronomer that calculate the relative size of the sun, moon, and earth. He did this by observing the moon during the lunar eclipse and estimating the angle on size of the earth. So next is Arabic intellectual. So during the first millennium, it is the very development of Arabic sciences. It is a rapid spread of Islam across the Middle East and North Africa from 7th century, and brought these Arab thinkers with classical texts like including the astronomical writing of Salami and some other intellectual that written in Islam. So one of these is the positional astronomy. So positional astronomy is used to locate astronomical objects on the celestial sphere, like the Earth. Using the positional astronomy, it can be locate the particular date, time, and location of the Earth. It relies in mathematical methods of spherical geometry and other measurement as astrometry. So this positional astronomy is used to calculate the position of heavenly bodies. So it's also rich in Zenith in Spain, that become dynamic center of Islamic in Jewish and Christian thought. So during the 13th century, King Alfonso of Castile sponsored this Alphonsine table. So this Alphonsine table is also written in Islam, and it is combined co-observation of centuries on Islamic record. So during the 17th century also, Islamic record provide a new calculation to Ptolemaic system and provide data that used to analyze the planetary position. So here they use the planetary position as the positional astronomy. So they can locate the planets. So doon na lumabas yung solar system natin, kung saan ang nasa gitna na is the sun, and then sunod-sunod na yung mga planets. So that's written in the Islamic record provided in 17th century using the Ptolemaic system that used to analyze the position of those celestial bodies. So there's still Ptolemy dogs. So since the Ptolemaic model complicated and questionable, more doubts added to keep prediction in hard in line. So therefore, this Nicole Oresme, during in 1377, he addressed all this problem on his work Book of Heaven and Earth. And during the 16th century, the forces of Renaissance and Protestant Reformation, so many religious doctrines opened up this dog. Therefore, Nicholas Copernicus again provide a new theory, which is heliocentric theory, where the shifting of the center of the universe from the Earth is the Sun. So dito na nagbago yung theory nila about the universe. So kung kanina ang theory is the Earth is the center of the universe, in heliocentric theory, the Sun is the center of the universe. And Copernicus first published his revolutionary ideas in short paper known as Commentaral Use, circulated among only in his friends in 1514. So this epicycle that regulates speed and planetary motions on certain paths and orbits. Thus, consequences of his model is vastly expanded the size of the Earth. This point of view, the stars could appear to shift back and forth. Therefore, there must be far away indeed. So this epicycle explored the planetary motion in the orbit and the other shift back across the sky. So that's the epicycle. So next is George Rheticus. George Rheticus is a mathematician traveled to Warmia just to become a student assistant of Copernicus in 1539. So Rheticus published his first widely disseminated views of Copernican system, known as Narratio Prima in 1540. So Rheticus also had a request to publish his own work, but Copernicus only agreed during 1543 before Copernicus died. So the mathematical instrument, Copernicus have this book, which is the revolutions of the heavenly sphere. So It was a vision of the universe as a coherent, integrated system where all the planets move together in harmony. So that's the work of Copernicus. And here it is the model, the Copernican model and heliocentric model. So when you say Copernican model or the geocentric model, it's simply the Earth is the center of the universe or the center of the solar system. It is a Copernican model was used in computations involved the Great Calendar reform made by Pope Gregory VIII in 1582. While the heliocentric model simply where the sun is the center of the universe. This is a non-issue, as the heliocentric model is purely mathematical instrument and not description of physical universe. So Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe is he also illustrated the Copernican model, but he did not adequately describe the planetary movement. Therefore, he resolved the problem and drew his own model, which is, he said, the planet revolve around the sun, but the sun and the moon remain revolving around the globe. And this is what he called the elliptical orbits taught by his student Johannes Kepler. So Tycho Brahe said that the planet or yung Earth nagre-revolve around the sun and the sun remain on revolving around the globe. Then Galileo Galilei used a telescope to prove that the sun was the center of the solar system and it is not the Earth. So his observations support the heliocentric theory of Copernicus, and he expressed this thought in his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems or the revolutionibus in 1616. Then the Darwin's Theory. Charles Darwin, probably all of us already heard about his works. So he is a British naturalist. They also first scientists suggest that the plants, animals, and any other living organism are not fixed and unchanging, or it is immutable. He proposed his idea in his works in the books called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, published in London in 1859. He described the book as one long argument, and of course his very famous theory of evolution, where the concept from demography, economics, and many other fields. So this theory of evolution is a process changing all forms of life in generations. So it really relies on genetic variation. Charles Darwin theory is also explained to his protege, which is Joseph Hooker, that his theory required no God or a changing species. So another trivia about scientists, not all scientists believe in God, because they believe that everything that they can touch or they can see, it doesn't exist. So ganun yung ibang scientists. But Charles Darwin said that at last gleams of light have come, and I am almost convinced that the species are not immutable. So the role of God. During 19th century, fossils were widely discussed in common society. Naturally formed rags, shapes that had nothing to do with living things. Others saw this as a handiwork of God put on earth to test his believers. So they believed that there were cadavers. The cadavers are the dead bodies that used to study the anatomy or something in scientific method. It's still alive in the world since God had created living things in perfections. Then George Cuvier, during 1796, French naturalists reconciled the religious ideas by invoking the catastrophes happened in the Bible. So George Cuvier is about catastrophism, or where there's a catastrophe happened in the world that swept the whole kind of living things, and that's the way of God replenished the earth with a new breed of species. Between each disaster, each species remained fixed and unchanging. Then Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is a professor of zoology in France. And he articulated in 1809 that about the philosophy zoology, which has first recent theory of evolution. So this theory of Lamarck is just like an outline of Darwinian theory of evolution. So view from Beagle. So Charles Darwin took the HMS Beagle from 1831 to 1836. So he collected all types of fossils, plants, and animal specimens for his study. And after his return to England, Darwin organized this massive data and supervised a multi-volume and multi-author report and the book called The Zoology of the Voyage of HMS Beagle. It is one of the best-selling accounts of his adventure. So this is the lastly. This is what Charles Darwin said in his book. Seeing the graduation and diversity of structure in one small variety of birds, one might really fancy that from the original variety of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. So that's what Charles Darwin said, and clearly public manifestation where his thought of evolution are heading. So that will be my report. The next reporter will be Mr. Joed Melchor.
Comparing species. Darwin's thoughts on possible evolution had been mounting throughout the Beagle's voyage, especially during his visit in Galapagos. He was greatly fascinated with the giant tortoises he saw and with the way of the shapes of their shells differed distinctly from island to island. He was impressed by species of mockingbirds. Then Darwin proposed that the different mockingbirds might have evolved from one common ancestors that had somehow flown across the Pacific from the mainland. Each variety of birds evolved by adapting to the particular environment present on each island and its available food. And lastly, the observations of giant tortoise, island foxes, and some other species supported these early conclusions. But Darwin was very sensitive about where such blasphemous thoughts would lead, and he said, such facts could undermine the stability of species. Next is Jigsaw Puzzle. While traveling in South America in 1831, Darwin read the first volume of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. Instead, he absorbed the ideas of geological renewal introduced by James Newton into a theory known as uniformitarianism. Accordingly, the Earth was continually being formed and altered over long time periods by different processes, such as wave erosion and volcanic explosions, that were the same as those happening today. Lyell's revolutionary ideas transformed the way Darwin interpreted the landscape formations, rocks, and fossils he found in his travels, which he now saw through Lyell's eyes. However, while he was still in South America, Volume 2 of Principles Geology arrived. Although Darwin spoke highly of Lyell as a geologist, he had to discount these latest ideas as the evidence of evolution mounted. Malthus' way of thinking was one of the main reasons for Darwin's theory of evolution. Next is Years of Silence. Even before the Beagle made its trip back to England, the nearest generated by the specimens Darwin had sent back had already made him a celebrity. Scientists around the world sent him various specimens and data. He studied the domestication of animals and certain plants, and even the role of selective breeding in birds, especially in pigeons. In 1855, he started breeding different kinds of rock doves, and they would be shown in the first two chapters in the book on the origin of species. Through his extensive work on pigeons, Darwin began to understand the relevance of variation among different individuals. Much later, in his autobiography, Darwin recalled his reaction when he first read Malthus back in 1838. Being well prepared to appreciate the struggle of existence, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. I had at last got a theory of which to work. With more knowledge about the role of variation, by 1856, Darwin, the pigeon breeder, could now imagine not humans but nature doing choosing. Next is joint action. In June of 1858, Darwin received a short essay by young British naturalist named Alfred Wallace. Wallace described in detail a flash of valuable insights in which he had somehow suddenly understood how evolution happened and asked Darwin for his comments. Darwin was very startled to read the Wallace insight replicated almost exactly the same ideas he himself had been working on for more than 2 decades. Worried about precedents, Darwin consulted Charles Lyell. They agreed to a joint presentation of Darwin and Wallace papers at the Linnean Society in London on July 1, 1958. Darwin now finished his book published on November 24, 1859. On the Origin of Species sold out all its copies on its very first day. And next is Darwin's Theory. Darwin directly provides that species are not immutable. They actually change or evolve, and the main instrument for this change is natural selection. The process relies on 2 factors. First, more offsprings are born than can survive when faced with the problems of climate, food supply, competition, predators, and even diseases. This leads to struggle for existence. Second, there is variation, sometimes imperceptible but nonetheless present. Among offsprings within a species for evolution to actually function, this variation must fulfill 2 criteria. Then, Darwin describes the process of evolution as a slow and gradual process. As a population of organisms adapts to the new environment, it becomes a new species, different from its ancestors. Meanwhile, those ancestors remain as they are, or they may evolve in response to their own changing environment, or they may lose the struggle for survival and suddenly become extinct. Then next is aftermath. Faced with such a thorough, reasoned, evidence-based argument of evolution by natural selection, most scientists soon accepted Darwin's concept of survival of the fittest. Darwin's book was careful to avoid any mention of human beings in connections with evolution, other than stating that light will be shed on the origin of man and history. However, there were vehement protests from the church, and the clear implication that humans had evolved from some other animals was ridiculed by many. As controversy mounted, many scientists sprang to his defense. The biologist Thomas Henry Huxley was aggressive in supporting the theory and argued case for human descent from apes, and even dubbed himself Darwin's bulldog. However, the instrument by which inheritance occurred, how and why some traits were passed on, others not remained a great mystery. Coincidentally, at the same period that Darwin published his book, a monk named Gregor Mendel was experimenting with Pea plants in the Czech Republic. His important work on inherited characteristics, released in 1865, formed the basis of genetics, but it was ignored by mainstream science until 20th century. When new discoveries in genetics were integrated into evolutionary theory, providing a process for heredity, Darwin's principle of natural selection remains a vital cog to understanding this. Next is Freudian thought. It is not an exaggeration to state that the unconscious one of the most intriguing concepts in psychology. It seems to contain all of our experience of reality, although it appears to be beyond our awareness or control. It is the peculiar place where we retain all our memories, thoughts, and feelings. This notion somewhat fascinated Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist Sigmund Freud, who wanted to find out if it was indeed possible to explain things that seemed to lie beyond the confines of psychology at the time. Those who had begun to examine the unconscious feared that it might be filled with psychic activity considered too powerful, frightening, and incomprehensible for our conscious mind to be able to integrate. Freud's work on this subject was pioneering and exacting. He succinctly described the structure of the mind as composed of the conscious, the unconscious, the preconscious. He popularized the idea of unconscious, short of introducing the notion that is the part of the mind that defines and explains the workings behind our ability to think and experience. Next is inside our mind. It is quite easy to take for granted the reality of the conscious and naively believe that what we think, feel, remember, and experience in our daily lives make up the entirety of the human mind. But Freud says that the active state of consciousness, that is, the operational mind, of which we are directly aware in our daily experience, is just a fraction of the total psychological forces at work in our physical reality. Beneath the conscious lies the powerful dimensions of the unconscious, the large warehouse from which our active cognitive state and behavior are dictated. Since the unconscious is all-encompassing and powerful, Freud says it contains within it the smaller spheres of the conscious and an area called the preconscious. Everything that is conscious that we actively know has at one time been the unconscious before rising to consciousness. The unconscious acts are receptacle for ideas or memories that are too powerful, too painful, or otherwise too much for the conscious mind to process. It is Freud's belief that when certain ideas or memories try to overwhelm the psyche, they are split apart from a memory that can be accessed by the conscious mind and stored in the unconscious instead. And next is hypnosis or hysteria. Freud's introduction to the world of unconscious came in the year 1885, when he stumbled upon the work of the French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, who seemed to be successfully treating patients for symptoms of mental illness using hypnosis. He then changed upon Joseph Breuer, a well-respected doctor who had found that he could greatly reduce the severity of his patient's symptoms of mental illness simply by asking her to describe her fantasies and hallucinations. Breuer included that her symptoms had been the result of hidden, disturbing memories buried in her unconscious mind, saying that the thoughts brought them to consciousness, allowing the symptoms to disappear. Breuer became Freud's best friend and colleague, and together the two developed and popularized a method of psychological treatment based on the idea that many forms of mental illness, such as irrational fears, anxiety, imagine, pains, and certain kinds of paranoia, were caused by traumatic experience that had occurred in the patient's past and were now trapped away from consciousness. Through Freud and Breuer's technique state in the jointly published studies in Hysteria 1895, they claim to have found a process to release the repressed memory from the unconscious, allowing the patient to consciously recall the memory and confront the experience both emotionally and intellectually.
Thank you, Joed. And so, for today, I'm Gwyneth Policarpio, and I am going to continue the rest of our report. So, let's go to dynamic thought. Dynamic thought. Freud was also influenced by the physiologist Ernst Bruch, who was one of the eventual founders of the 19th century's New Physiology, which looked for mechanistic explanation for all organic phenomena. Bruch claimed that every other living organism, the human, is essential bundle of energy system, and so must follow the principle of conservation of energy. Principle of the conservation of energy. This law states that the total amount of energy in a system stays constant over a period of time. It cannot be destroyed, moved, or transformed. While the physical energy, this energy, he said, can undergo modification, transmission, and conversion, but it cannot be destroyed. So if we have a thought that the conscious mind finds inaccessible, the mind redirects this away from continuous conscious thought into the unconscious in a process Freud termed as repression. For example is maaari nating pigilin ang mga alaala na nagmula sa ating childhood trauma or ang mga bagay na hindi matanggap or the ideas that otherwise threaten our well-being or way of life. Next is motivating drives. The unconscious is also the domain where our instinctual biological drives reside. The drive governs our behavior, directing us toward choices that promise to satisfy our basic needs. The drive ensures our survival as a race, the need for food and water, the desire for sex, to ensure the continuation of our species, and the necessity to find warmth and shelter, including companionship. But Freud claims that the unconscious also holds a contrasting drive, the death drive, which is present from birth. Of course, hindi natin maiiwasan ang death, so this drive is somewhat self-destructive and impels us forward. Though we do so, we are moving closer to our eventual death habang naglalakbay tayo sa mundong ito. In his later statements, Freud moved away from the idea that the mind was structured by the conscious, unconscious, and preconscious to propose a new controlling structure, which is the ID, ego, and the superego. The ID, composed of primitive impulses, obeys the pleasure principle, which says that every wishful impulse must be immediately gratified. It wants everything now. Simply, the ego says na lahat ng mga gusto natin is makukuha natin. The second one is the ego. Recognizes the reality principle, which states that we cannot have everything we desire. We must take account of the world we live in. Meaning, hindi lahat ng gusto natin is makukuha natin. Kailangan nating paghirapan ang lahat. And lastly is the superego. It's a judging force, the source of our conscience, guilt, and shame. The superego incorporates the values and morals of society na natutunan natin sa mga magulang natin o sa ibang tao. It is the voice of conscience or doing what is right and source of self-criticism. And the third one is psychoanalytical treatment. Psychoanalytical treatment. Since the unconscious remains inaccessible, the only way the conflicts can be given cognition is through the symptoms that are present in the conscious. Emotional suffering for Freud is the result of this unconscious conflict. We cannot continually fight against ourselves, holding off the uprising of repressed material and against the strong force of death without such emotional turmoil. Psychoanalysis. It's only performed by a certified therapist trained in Freud's specific approach and is the therapy that encourages a patient to lie on a couch and talk. From Freud's first treatments, psychoanalysis has been practiced in numerous sessions that can sometimes last for many hours and take place several times in a week and even continue for many. While unconscious thought cannot be retrieved through normal procedure of introspection, the unconscious can converse with the conscious in some creative way. During some analysis, the analyst acts as a mediator trying to allow unspoken thoughts or unbearable feelings to come to light. The interpretation of dreams. Freud claims that every dream represents a wish fulfillment, and the more unacceptable the wish is to our conscious mind, the more distorted the desire becomes in our dreams. So the unconscious, he says, sends message to our conscious mind in codes. There are a number of techniques that allows the unconscious to emerge. One of the first to be discussed by Freud is the interpretation of dreams. So accordingly, the primary sources for this is ang mga memories natin noong mga early childhood natin is where being naked was not frowned and wala pang sense of shame noon. Kahit wala kang saplot is hindi ka nahihiya and that is on your early childhood. Ganun yung sinasabi ng interpretation of dreams. Accessing unconscious. The other well-known ways in which the unconscious reveals itself are through Freudian sleeps and the process of free association. A Freudian sleep is a verbal error or slip of the tongue, and it is said to reveal a really repressed belief, thought, or emotion. Slip of tongue is ito yung nasasabi natin involuntarily or kapag nabibigla tayo, which reveal what we truly feel. And let's talk about how Freud used the free association technique, and it is also developed by Carl Jung. Free association technique is where patients heard a word and were then invited to say the first word that came into their minds. He believed that this process allowed the unconscious to break through our mind, uses automatic association so hidden thoughts come out before the conscious mind has a change to interrupt. To help a person emerge from the repressed state and begin to continuously actually deal with the real issues affecting him or her, Freud believes that it is necessary to access the suppressed feelings. For example, is if a mind find it difficult to confront other, mas pipiliin niya na lang kimkimin ito kaysa kumprontahin pa ang isang tao, na ang maaaring kinalalabasan ng pagkimkim is anger, anxiety, depression, drug and alcohol abuse, or eating disorder. Analysis allows trapped memories and feelings to come out, and the patient is often surprised to feel the hidden emotion that has been buried. It is not uncommon for patients to find themselves moved to tears by a specific issue from many years ago that they felt they had long since gotten over. This emotional response demonstrates that the event and the feeling is sariwa pa, and kinikimkim nila sa mahabang panahon rather than dealt with it. The next one is School of Psychoanalysis. Freud founded the prominent psychoanalytic society in Vienna, with which he exerted his very powerful influence on the mental health community of experts at the time, training others in his method and acting as the main authority on the subject. Over time, his students and other professionals modified his thoughts, eventually splitting the society into three. The first one is the Freudians, who remained true to Freudian knowledge. The second one is Kleinians, who followed the ideas of Melanie Klein. The third one is Neo-Freudians, a later group who also incorporated Freud's idea into their broader practice. Modern psychoanalysis identifies at least 22 different schools of thought, though Freud's revolutionary ideas in the field continue to remain very influential for all contemporary practitioners. The next one is information advancement. Advances in information technology, or IT, are affecting most segments of business, society, and government today in many, if not most, regions of the world. The changes that it has brought in various aspects of man's life are often collectively called the information revolution. And we are all alam natin lahat ito, na through media and any information can spread easily, and maikalat natin ito through technology or using apps like Facebook by Meta, Google, and any other social media platforms na kaya maglabas ng mga news or articles. And what is information revolution? Information revolution is a period of change that might prove as significant to the lives of people. Computer technology is at the root of this change, and continuing advancement in that technology seem to ensure that this revolution would touch the lives of many people. Like yung nagagawa ng technology ngayon sa mga tao. But sometimes, too much technology can be toxic, or too much using in a app can be toxic sometimes. And lastly is, since Sigmund Freud is being mentioned in our topics, let me introduce him to you. Sigmund Freud, a German born in Sigismund Freud, or on May 6, 1856. He was an Austrian neurologist and the founder of psychoanalysis, a clinical method for evaluating and treating pathologies in the psyche through a dialogue between a patient and a psychoanalyst. And that's all for today's lesson. We hope you learned a lot through this video presentation or report, and we hope you gain knowledge about our topic. Again, I am Gunat Policarpio, and on behalf of my group mates, Salve Cataroja and Joed Melchor, thank you for listening.